Hey everyone, thanks for joining us bright and early this morning as we start our first round of Assyriology interviews for candidates for the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Grant. We're here with our first candidate this morning. I'm so excited for you all to get to meet her. Hi Kate, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Totally our pleasure. Can you start by just introducing yourself and letting us know where you're currently studying?
Sure. My name's Kate Justament, and I am a Ph.D. candidate at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University.
That's wonderful. That's an institute that I interact with a lot, and great folks over there.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit how you got started studying Assyriology?
Man, it feels like a crazy journey. I feel like it started when I was a kid. My mom read my brother and I Greek mythology growing up, and I found that to be like a fantasy story and so fascinating. And so I took Latin in high school and kind of entered through that traditional classics route, and then started taking those courses in college as well. But I took this one course on the Persian Empire and sort of the politics and the administration of it, and really sort of realized there's this whole broader, more ancient past that was there to study. So I think that's kind of what lured me back further into the ancient Near East, which is what I study at ISAW. And so, I've not regretted it.
That's good to hear. Yeah. Can you tell us then a little bit about your current research interests now that you've moved a little past Greek myth?
Yeah, sure. So right now I'm in my fifth year, so I'm working on my dissertation, and I focus on broadly ancient Near Eastern art and archaeology, but more specifically, I study second and first millennium BCE, so around 2000 to 0 BCE. Art and archaeology of northern Mesopotamia, which is modern day Syria, Iraq, parts of southeastern Turkey. And I'm looking specifically at the Assyrian Empire. And I'm interested in questions of how politics and administration, how these relationships between people in power and then local populations are negotiated. And I try to look at these relationships through a wide array of sources. So not just texts, but also art objects, archaeological data, and then I try to synthesize all of these sources to find a more holistic picture of sort of on the ground workings of the Assyrian Empire. And specifically, I'm focusing on 3 case studies in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE.
Can you tell us a little bit about those case studies?
Sure. So it was kind of a fortuitous discovery through several seminar papers and courses that I took during the first few years of my graduate program, that these case studies are connected by specific officials and kings that kind of have these interesting connections. So the first follows one official under the reign of one king, and they're connected to the second case study by just a number of like 15 years, and we have direct evidence of their interactions. And so it's this really, I think, nice vignette into a time in which we're able to say some more explicit things about specific people, which is very rare when it comes to the ancient world. So I'm trying to find these bits of evidence that connect people in order to maybe paint a bigger picture about the trends that are happening within the Assyrian Empire on an administrative level. And then the third case study is connected more on a site basis. We have connections on how sites have transformed from one period to another. And so I've been finding it really fruitful and interesting to kind of connect these in a narrative way as well while I'm writing my dissertation.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly interesting. What are your specific plans then for this summer, and how will HAPS funding help you achieve them?
So another project that I've been working on the past year, which I've been very fortunate to be involved with, is this seal digitization project with the Yale Babylonian Collection up at Yale University. They've been working for the past couple years to redigitize their entire collection, all of their tablets, their cuneiform tablets, and all of their seals, whether they be cylinder seals or stamp seals. And so I've been working as a graduate intern to help with the seal digitization part. And COVID has obviously presented some difficulties with getting there in person, but I'm really looking forward to the more serious potential that this summer I'll be going to the collection in person to finally assist with the physical digitization of these seals, because I think it's a really important project, and they'll be then used to create a new public-facing database that everyone can access.
That sounds like it will be an incredibly useful tool. We are able to take questions from the audience if anyone watching has any questions for Kate, but while we wait for people to type those out, I have a couple I'd like to throw at you.
Sure.
I'm hoping you can walk us through what digitization means for a seal.
Yeah, it's a really complicated process. I didn't know myself before starting. So for those who aren't familiar, cylinder seals are these very small objects that are shaped in a cylinder shape, and they usually have a perforation going through the middle because they're these objects that were typically worn on the person as an amulet or a piece of jewelry. They're used for about 4,000 years of history. So it's fascinating to see this longue durée of them. And for the digitization of them, you require a lot of intense photography equipment. There's these pedestals that you place the seals on, and these different camera setups with all these different lighting equipment. We use something called an Adaptalux, which kind of looks like an octopus. It has all of these different arms that can light the object from different angles so that you're getting the best exposure. And then the pedestal rotates and you take a scan, basically a 360-degree photographic scan of the seal. And so you can get an incredibly high quality image of the seal. And then it's part of this larger discussion that we're having at the YBC in order to figure out the best way that people can sort of access this type of information, since they are 3D objects and, you're missing that tactile in-person experience if you're viewing it online. So we're thinking about ways in which we can unroll the physical surface of the seal and sort of show it to you like on a 2D level, and also do like different layouts of images to try to get that 3D physicality for a viewer.
Very cool. We have a question from the audience right now, I think related to this, which is, will everyone be able to access these digitizations? That includes the public?
Yes, it's going to exist in their online museum and in a museum database style. So that's the part of the project that I've been working with the most over the last year, since it's been more virtual, with the conceptualization of the brand new database. So it's going to be fully publicly accessible. And another aspect that they're looking at is Arabic language translation, because these are objects that originate from the ancient Middle East. And so we want to make sure that people in, across the world who speak Arabic are able to access the information about these objects as well. So once it's all published, it will be all available to the public.
That's great. These cylinder seals, do they form just part of the material evidence that you're looking at for your broader research interests? What other types of material evidence goes into that?
Yes, absolutely. They're a crucial part of my dissertation, because a fascinating aspect of seals are that they are sometimes, and I would say most famously, known to serve as sort of administrative or like a signature purpose. So all of my officials and the administrators that I'm looking at in my dissertation use these. But on top of that, I look at a number of monumental artworks. I'm thinking about people who held power, and so they typically are of upper status, and so they have the resources to create objects that are monumental in size, something that people who go to a museum might see, whether they're palace reliefs carved in stone or these large freestanding stone monuments called stelae, which are typically sort of tall pillars with a rounded top, and they have different images carved on the front of them. So
very cool. We have more questions from the audience. What information is on a seal? Is it more than just a name or title?
Yeah, that's a great question. Seals are, I wish I could just show you guys so many images because they're just amazing. So they're typically so small and they're 3D. And the way a seal works is, it's important to know, if they're stamped, they work just as the name implies. They're sort of pressed down into wet clay and they create a raised impression. The cylinder seals are carved all around the 360 surface. And so you push down and then you roll across the wet clay, and it creates this sort of frieze-like impression raised impression on the surface. And so they're covered with all types of images and then sometimes text. I would say the primary thing that's on seals are images. And so they've been very useful in iconographic and art historical studies for all periods and all cultures in which they exist. And you can often date cylinder seals based on the style of carving or the types of imagery that are found on them, because one unfortunate piece of information about them is most seals come from unprovenanced find spots at this point in time.
So the images that are on these seals, can we think of them then as like individual logos, or are they more just representations of like a general visual aesthetic of the time?
I would excuse me, tend to say more of the latter. I think the personalization you find when it comes to the texts and the labeling, because then you can have specific names and genealogy or maybe a personal inscription. The images might have some personalization in like what combination appears, but overall you're going to find much more sort of culturally thematic types of images that fit within the sort of, you know, stream of tradition for that time period. So for the Assyrian Empire, you see a lot of what can be called ritual scenes with different divine symbols. That was a very popular thing. So you might see some different personalization in the selection of various divine symbols that appear on one official seal versus another. But then a standard scene of the warrior god Ninurta shooting this mythical demon Ansu bird would be the same. So it's really fascinating.
Very cool. Ties back in with some of the myths that got you here in the first place, huh?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, Kate.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes with our next interview candidate, so stay tuned. And if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll see if we can next candidate. Hi, everyone. We're here with our next candidate to continue talking about some exciting summer research opportunities. Today, we're talking to Dr. Christopher Jones. Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us today. Can you introduce yourself and let us know where you're currently studying?
My name's Christopher Jones. I just finished my Ph.D. at Columbia University in Neo-Assyrian history. So I study the internal politics of the Assyrian Empire. My dissertation examines how officials in the Assyrian Empire were competing against each other for power and status. They stole from each other. They promoted their relatives to positions of power. They attempted to steal land. They attempted to sideline their rivals by accusing them of all sorts of crimes, and always present themselves to the king as these perfect subordinates. And I argue that Assyrian kings encouraged this because it divided their officials against each other and kept them from banding together to plot against the king. So if you set up an environment where everybody's fighting each other over who can impress you the most, you've created an environment where if anybody is plotting against you, the other people are going to tell, right? So where this leaves, furthers our understanding of the empire is that a lot of scholarship has interpreted Assyria as a very centralized, authoritarian political system, where the king sits at the top and just controls everything. And that's certainly how Assyrian kings portray themselves. If you look at the relief sculptures, the king's out there leading his army, dressed up, super fancy. If you read the royal inscriptions, you would think that the kings single-handedly built entire cities, by themselves, and then defeated entire armies single-handedly, because they rarely mention their subordinates at all. But what I'm trying to do is understand Assyrian kings more as managing a team of subordinates who are, through manipulating and controlling them by encouraging competition, playing favorites, forming trusting relationships with some officials and not others. So that's my main themes of my research. And for this project, the specific project I'm pursuing involves something that kind of spun off from my dissertation research, which is one of the few groups of people who do have the resources and the lack of, to successfully plot against the king are the king's own sons.
That sounds like an HBO drama ready to go.
It could be. It could very well be.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in looking at the internal politics? Or even just Assyria in general, like what got you to this part of the world?
I don't know. I've been interested in ancient Mesopotamia since I was a child, alongside also being interested in Greece and Egypt and the like. So yeah, it's kind of as long as I can remember, I was checking out stacks of books from the library about this sort of thing. How I got to the internal politics specifically is during my master's degree, I wrote a paper on a specific type of palace in Assyria, and people had proposed all sorts of ideas about what this palace was for. It was a military training center. It was an arsenal, and when I looked at the archaeological reports and what the palace was actually used for, it was pretty much used for anything that you needed space for. So that got me thinking about organization and how a lot of scholarship is trying to construct these very hierarchical models that don't really explain how organizations work. They don't really let you understand the internal politics between individuals and between departments. And everyone who's been in an organization knows how these internal politics work, right? That power struggles between managers and things like that. They happen everywhere. So that got me into reading scholarship on organizational theory and social network analysis, and that gave me new tools to try to understand how Assyrian officials related to each other.
That's fascinating. I have more questions for you, but I do want to just ask, how can HAPS funding help you work on this research project this summer?
Okay, so the research project I want to pursue is about the assassination of the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 681 BC. It's an event that shook the empire to its core. It's recorded in Babylonian sources. It's recorded in the Bible. And he's killed by one of his own sons, a guy named Urad-Melisu, who then tries to seize the throne for himself. But he fails, and he flees to Assyria's archenemy Urartu, and his younger brother, Esarhaddon, 6 weeks after the assassination, enters Nineveh and becomes king. Well, what happened here? We know that Sennacherib had designated Urad-Melisu as his successor a couple years earlier, but then he changed his mind and picked Esarhaddon instead. Provides motive, but then something really strange happens. A few months before the assassination, Sennacherib sends Esarhaddon away to Syria, and we don't know why. Some scholars have argued that he thought Esarhaddon was going to get assassinated, so he sent him away for his own safety. Well, problem with that is, if he knew it was going to happen, why didn't he stop it? Next suggestion is that Sennacherib changed his mind for a third time and was going to designate somebody else as his successor. And then some people have gone so far as to suggest that Esarhaddon orchestrated his father's murder from Syria and then marched in to take control of the empire. So big question in resolving this is we don't know where exactly Esarhaddon went, but I think I can solve this problem. After Esarhaddon became king, we have two different letters that were found in Nineveh from people who are basically attempting to call in favors, reminding Esarhaddon about how they'd stood by him in his darkest hour, basically. And each mentions that after Sennacherib's assassination, they had fled with Esarhaddon to a place called Isete. Now, that's an Akkadian word that means the tower. Where is the tower? Well, there's one place in Syria called the tower, but it's actually, in Akkadian, its name is Durkat Limu. But in Aramaic, which was the common vernacular in Syria at the time, it's called Magdalu, which means the tower in Aramaic. So if Esarhaddon was in Durkat Limu, that solves a couple problems. One, people have questioned how he was able to react so quickly. 6 weeks later, he's leading troops into Nineveh. But if he were in Durkat Limu, which is in eastern Syria, it's much closer to Nineveh, the communication time and reaction time is much less. And two, Durkat Limu was a major provincial center from the late Bronze Age, 1300 BC onwards. So it could explain why Esarhaddon sent there, not to hide him or because he's been disowned or something like that, but in order to gain experience in administration and preparation for becoming king, as other crown princes of the Assyrian Empire did as well. So how can HAPS help with this? To show that Durkat Limu was still an important provincial center, got to turn to archaeology. The site was excavated from 1978 to 1988, but it was just published last January. So bit of a delay there, but that's archaeology. That's how it works. And I teach at a small school with a very small undergraduate focused library that's not buying the latest excavation reports in German. So I would use the grant primarily to purchase books that are vital for this project, and also to cover things like image permissions for publication and something like that for the article I plan to write once I've pulled all of this together.
That sounds fascinating. We have a question from the audience, and this is just a reminder.
Excellent.
Anyone watching, if you have questions, feel free to type them in. I'm sure Dr. Jones will be happy to address them. Our first question is, and it may seem obvious, but why study Assyria at all? All of the internal politics that you were discussing are happening in current politics too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think studying Assyria is important to understand the origins of some of these bureaucratic fights, because Assyria, you could call it the first empire in world history. I mean, yes, there are plenty of other empires, Egypt, Hittites, Hammurabi, but all those empires worked with this core area that was militarily powerful, governing over a bunch of vassal states. And as many of those late Bronze Age empires found, the weakness of this is that those vassals can gang up on you, and then you're one small core area versus like 20 other states. And that's how a number of empires, not just in the Near East, but Zhou Dynasty China, places like that, collapsed. Assyria tries to avoid this by creating provinces with appointed governors that are appointed at the pleasure of the king. Some of them are locals, some of them aren't. But the idea is to exert more direct control over conquered territory and incorporate that into a more unified state. And Assyria is really the first time this happens in world history. So you want to understand later empires, you want to understand Persia, you want to understand Rome, you want to understand all that came after that. This model of organization begins in Assyria. So that's why I find Assyria worthwhile to study.
A great and thorough answer. Can you tell us a little bit about the types of material evidence you expect will come out of these archaeological records you hope to dive into?
Administrative buildings. We'll see how long the administrative buildings, which we know were used in the Middle Assyrian period, that is in the late Bronze Age, how they continued into the Neo-Assyrian period. What exactly were they doing there? Were they storing tax supplies? Did they keep records? Do you find evidence of administrations, seals, things of that nature? That's all stuff that I want to look at to see what exactly the Assyrians were doing at Dur-Katlimu during the time of Esarhaddon.
Great. We have one final audience question before we let you go. Will the role of religious temples on influencing the Assyrian politics be mentioned in your study? And do you think they did play a big role in ancient Mesopotamian politics?
It's a great question. I did talk about this a little bit in my dissertation. Basically, I see there's kind of three big sectors of the Assyrian Empire. You have individual officials competing with each other, but you also have these sectors which are the temple, the provincial administration, and the palaces. The palace isn't just a big house of the king. It's a giant, estates with all sorts of land and, agricultural workers that are tied to the land. They oversee craft production, textiles, things of that nature. The temple is a similar way, and it's a big household of God. They also control land. They also oversee craft production. They also collect taxes. As far as the influence that they have over Assyrian politics, I mean, once again, they're in competition for resources with the palace and the city. They don't necessarily have the ability to tell the king what to do, if that's part of the question. Kings are definitely expected to do certain things for the temple, but the temple does lose in some of these battles. I've got several letters from temple priests to the king that are like, governors are not paying their taxes. Like, these are your gods that we're talking about that are not getting offerings because the governor of this province hasn't paid taxes in 5 years. They're not necessarily the most advantaged space in these sort of bureaucratic battles between sectors.
Great, interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Jones. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Yeah. All right, we'll be back in just a couple minutes here with our next Assyriological candidate. Welcome back. We're here with our next candidate to talk about their summer research plans. Hi, Celeste, how are you?
Hi, good, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining us this morning. Can you introduce yourself and tell us where you're currently studying?
Yes, my name is Celeste Onchuk, and I live in Alabama in the U.S., and actually my studies are through the University of Haifa in Israel. So I'm doing everything right now, definitely online, and working with my advisor via email and, online ways. So that's where I'm studying, and I've just actually been in the program officially for a little bit over a year. And so it's my first year, that I've been working on all of my studies that have led up to this for probably 2.5 years.
Wonderful. Well, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the field then?
Well, yeah, I think that most archaeologists would say that they loved it since they were a little child, and I say the same thing. I love digging in the dirt for treasures or anything I could find, and a treasure didn't have to be, a real treasure, but anything that wasn't dirt, that's what I was looking for. So I was probably doing that by the age of 3 or 4, and nobody told me to do that. It just occurred to me naturally, I guess. And so I've always looked for opportunities to get my hands on dirt and dig and all of that. But around here, the archaeological, availability of what you can study would be the Native American cultures. And, I guess we have things up to the Civil War that would be interesting finds. And I found a few things. But, we even have our own property where we have found, interestingly, a grindstone that is exactly the type of things that my advisor studies. He's the Grindstone Tools laboratory director at Haifa, and so we found something a couple of years ago that's I actually have it over there in the background. I don't know which way to turn my no. Well, I can't get it. Oh, it's behind me. There
okay.
We go. Yeah. Anyway, but that my interest never really was in the Native American stuff as much as the Near East. I mean, ever since I was little, I was interested in the Holy Land, and so when I was finally able to get the chance to go there, that's when it all started, and that's how I got connected through the Biblical Archaeology Society, and it just all fell into place over the past couple of years with me being able to dig in Israel at Tel Saf, and with my advisor, things just fell into place. So.
That's wonderful. What great kismet. Are your research interests then aligned with your advisor in these tools in archaeological tools?
Well, not exactly. What I'm doing kind of, I think, is an extension of his interest in. It is very interesting to me as I've studied it over the past couple of years. It is interesting, definitely. But when I'm able to get out more on my own, I'm probably going to shift into more of the biblical archaeology. What period, I'm not exactly sure. Probably leaning more toward the Roman period. But even though it's not exactly what he does, I mean, it's still interesting, and I'm still really enjoying getting my foot in the door and learning a lot, because I learn a lot every day. So.
Absolutely, yeah. So then what are your summer research plans, and how can HAPS funding help you achieve them?
Well, things have changed quite a bit since, even the last couple of months. I was planning on going to Israel and working with my advisor at the dig site that I've been before, or even possibly if they weren't going to do that, just working with him on my writing. But things look better with the pandemic situation. Like, I might be able to go, and then the conflict is just started in the last week, and I just don't think that that's going to be feasible. But I have a couple of other options as far as going somewhere. I've not decided yet, but I'm either looking at Egypt or Chicago. Big difference, but the Oriental Institute in Chicago has a lot of things that are related to my studies. So that might be the best possibility. Although I'm definitely open to Egypt if I can work things out. So there's a lot of things in the museums there that I need to see, and firsthand would be a great experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to sort of swivel quickly to account for world events is a real skill, I feel like, in this field. So I have some additional questions for you, but just a reminder to everyone watching, if you have any questions for Celeste about her work and research, feel free to enter them in. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them. But I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what types of archaeological evidence you might be interested in looking at, even at the OI or on a dig in Egypt. Yeah.
Okay, yes. So what I'm focusing on is images of food processing from the Neolithic through the second part of the Iron Age, possibly even into the Roman area in the ancient Near East. So my studies encompass Egypt and Greece and Cyprus and the Levant, but the majority of what I've been finding have been from tombs, and not finding like digging, but finding online and things that have already been excavated. The majority of things come from tombs in Egypt, and then the next most that I found from Greece, and tombs in Greece and in Cyprus. And so also the couple of finds that are from the Levant were also in tombs. And I'm not limiting it to figurines, but that is the majority of what I found from those places, little statuettes, or figurines. But any kind of representation of food processing, particularly grain grinding. And so there are a couple of things that I've come across from Assyria and Persia, but it's quite different. And I've not been able to get very deep into that yet, because I've been really kind of stuck in the Egyptian figurines right now for the past while. So what I found elsewhere are palace gates have some relief images of soldiers processing grains, and so I'm very interested in uncovering more about the reasons why. And so the reasons that I'm like, why were these made? What motivated the artist to make these? Now, and what I've come to find is the majority definitely have mortuary purposes, ritualistic purposes. So the question that leaves me is, are there any purposes besides mortuary purposes? Or is that really all we find them for, except in Persia and Assyria on the palace gates? That's going to be different. But is there anything besides that they were used for? And so, yeah, that's where I'm.
That's fascinating. That's such an interesting concept that you would want to sort of depict these food production techniques in ritual figurines.
Right. They're not, it's kind of an overlooked data set where it may have been included in the study of figurines in general, or the study of servant statuettes from Egyptian tombs, but never has there been one focused study on the food processing figurines or other images, just those alone. But I'm also doing the cross-cultural and more holistic research of it all. So that's what makes it novel, and that's what makes it different than what I've found before.
Can you maybe give us a little primer? You don't have to go into too much detail on what types of food processing techniques might be found.
Yes. So what is the most common thing I'm finding are images of women grinding at a saddle quern or grindstone, and it's really amazing how it's just worldwide, even it's consistent for such a long period of time, until the millstone, until animals were attached to the millstones. What you find is women with a grindstone on their knees with a slab at the bottom and then a top stone. So yeah, it's worldwide. And initially my advisor wanted to do a worldwide study, but we ended up having to limit that to just the Near East, which is fine with me, because that's where my interest lies. Yeah.
Sure. Also, tackling the entire archaeology of the world is like a lot, right?
Right. The catalog. I'm making a catalog as well online, which is something that I don't think exists already. It's just a catalog of all the images of grinding grain, and it's pretty big already. That's what's taken a great portion of my time. It's pretty big, and I don't know how I would have encompassed the whole world. Egypt took, a good long time. Yeah.
Is this a database that might be available to the public?
It's not yet. I'm not sure when we're going to publish it, for the public to access, but it will be. It will be. It's not going to be all inclusive. Obviously, I can't document everything from the entire Near East, but as much as I can, it's going to be pretty inclusive. So it's taken a while, and we want to have kind of a more finished product before it's published. So.
Sure. Yeah. A reminder to anyone watching, if you have any questions for Celeste, we've still got some time. I want to ask a little bit, you mentioned that these figurines tend to be women who are doing the grinding. Is the process of food processing and preparation gendered in a lot of the cultures that you're looking at?
Yes, and that is definitely a great question, because that is an entire aspect of my research. I mean, one part of it is totally dedicated to how gender roles were assigned, and was that consistent throughout cultures in the ancient Near East? And I'm finding that yes, it appears to be the case that it was women. Not always the same socioeconomic status, but that's another aspect I'm looking at. But yes, I'm finding women. Now, interestingly, there are a few statues of men grinding grain that we have come across in Egypt, but there's a reason for that, and they're not representative of real life. But the reason why the men were depicted as grinding grain in the servant statues in the tombs in Egypt was because they were representing someone else and something to secure a place in the afterlife for an important person in the pharaoh's life, like his scribe or his high priest or her high priest. Those people have been depicted grinding grain, but it's only to secure a place in the afterlife, for them to give them a position, a job in the afterlife. And so that's the only time I've found any men doing it. Yeah.
That's really interesting. We do have a question from the audience. Is there any indication that some cultures had better, more efficient food processing than others?
I think that's probably going to be no. From what I found, I think the Greeks were first to start using millstones, but I may be incorrect there. What I have noticed, though, that's outside of my study, is that the Native Americans use these most primitive ways of grinding grain for much, much longer. And I'm not studying Native Americans, but finding the grindstone so close to the surface of the ground here just shows us that it was used a lot later on than the ones that we found from people have found from 2000, 3000 BC in the Near East. So some cultures moved more quickly into a different type, more advanced or better way of doing it, but basically they all did it the same way.
Interesting. We've got a couple more questions from the audience here. Was it all food processing, or were maybe some herbs for medical purposes being processed as well?
Possibly so. I think that there would be those images would be more of people using a mortar and pestle, and I've not ruled that out either. I do have some images of women, some men I've found using a mortar and pestle, but yeah, I think that herbs or medicinal things would be with maybe a different type of groundstone tool, and so I can kind of tell what is what. But beer processing, beer brewing, and is fairly similar. There are some similar steps, and so I've kind of had to separate the two as I've been looking for images. Yeah, so.
That's great. Do we have any additional questions from the audience related to any of this research? Just to give you a little time to type, maybe I'll throw one more question out at Celeste. Thank you for taking all of my questions, by the way. Can you maybe even just simply talk about the types of grains that are being processed in this way? Is it similar throughout a lot of the Middle East?
Yes. Emmer wheat and barley are what I'm, finding. And I'm also looking at some of the starch analysis, things that have been left on the grindstone, just remnants of what grains have been left on the grindstones. And so we're mostly in barley and wheat. Nothing else really. Corn shows up elsewhere, but not really in the Middle East, or Near East.
Sure, great. Well, some of that's very familiar to us, I'm sure. Barley is a grain that we're familiar with here.
Yeah, not so much here. We don't use barley much here. Wheat, yes, but I'm glad that I don't have to do it the way they do. I'm very glad I can just go get a loaf of bread.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for talking with us today, Celeste.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, our pleasure. We'll be back, folks, in just a couple of minutes here with our last interview of the morning. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're ready for our final interview of this morning's section, and we're here today with Amir. Hi, Amir.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing
Sorry,
great.
it's not morning here, it's night here, so.
Oh, well,
good morning
good
there,
evening.
good night here.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about where you're currently studying and just give us a basic introduction?
Yeah, so I'm studying my PhD in the University of Sydney in Australia. That's why the time difference. And my PhD is mainly about the environmental impact of ancient copper metallurgy in Oman, in southern Persian Gulf region.
Very interesting. How did you get involved or interested in that topic?
So I was interested in the Persian Gulf archaeology, like during my undergrad. And fortunately, I had an opportunity to meet like Dr. Lenner, who is like a prominent scholar in the region. And they had this long ongoing project in the region called like Archaeological Water Histories of Oman. And I was able to accompany them in a season in the field. And as a side project, I could introduce this project of going there and actually assessing the environments of each site, the immediate environment of each site, and that's how I got involved with the whole project, and especially my PhD.
Fascinating. So can you tell us a little bit about your summer research plans and how HAPS can help achieve them?
Yeah, so as you all know, it's quite hard to especially get out of Australia because of like the COVID situation. Not that my research exactly depends on traveling, but because I already have like terabytes and terabytes of data that I have to analyze before the next season. We are always behind fieldwork, so there's no worries about that. There's always data for me to analyze. But actually, this summer I have an exemption to travel to northern Persian Gulf in Iran, in like especially Kerman, and also if possible in Oman. We are not sure yet about the situation in Oman. They might allow us to go for another season. And also, I'm writing my first few chapters of my thesis, so I'm going to be quite busy.
Yeah, that's a lot of work to take on. What is your thesis about?
As I've mentioned, it's about the environmental impact of ancient metallurgy, ancient copper production in Oman. So in Oman, when you go in Oman, you'll see all these like old slag heaps. So all these like metal junks, basically, that were compiled into like a heap or like a mound. And they are like giant mounds, like 100,000 tons, 45,000 tons each. But like they basically are dated to three different periods. First is like early to middle Bronze Age or Manar period, or early Iron Age, and also the early Islamic era. And there is like long halts in between. And many archaeologists have like dwelled about like what is the reason behind this what we call periodicity, why there's like these long halts in betweens. And one of the hypotheses has been that they have actually exhausted their environment. They over harvested all the woody biomass around them, and that's why they had to stop, because basically it was not economical for them to import wood from other regions. It would have been too expensive. It didn't make economical sense. So my PhD thesis is to finally have like a sound methodology to test this hypothesis, because there has been much ink spilled on it, but to actually go there and measure this and put the two sides of the equation together, like on one side measuring all those heaps, how much do they weigh and how much charcoal they needed to produce that amount of copper, and on the other side also measure how many wood biomass in kg would have been available for them to use. So there are two different things.
Is the primary environmental impact then on like the depletion of the wood and natural resources needed to produce these types of metal?
Yeah, that's the primary impact.
Interesting. Are there secondary environmental impacts? Like, do you look at changes in the biome or anything like that?
Yes, definitely there are, but since we are like a very small team and we have very limited excavations, it's very hard to test for us. But definitely, yeah, like if in future we have more resources, we definitely would be able to like have probably cores, like geological cores into the wadi, like dried out riverbeds or like dried lakes or ancient lakes. And they would definitely tell us more about the environment and how the biome has changed as a consequence these human activity. But for now, I'm just focusing on the primary impact.
That's fantastic. We have a question from the audience about your research here. Do copper and bronze can both be used for tools as for weapons, but were there other common uses for these materials?
Yeah, definitely. So that, as you mentioned, weapons are one thing, and actually one of our sites, which is very interesting, is in the middle of the desert, like buried in the dunes. But like probably one of those things that you only see in the movies. Like they were like copper vessels actually emerging from the sand dunes, because the sand dunes move. And these coppers were like discovered by tourists actually in 2016. So it was like one of those things that you only see like in the news. But definitely, like we have other tools, like agricultural tools, like hoes, or other things like hammers, or other things that were used, and also lots of things that can be used for residential purposes, like vessels or household items, everything.
That's fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of actually processing these metals to make them usable, to turn them into agricultural tools or weapons or anything?
Yeah, so basically what we have is like what we call like a two-step kind of archimetal like copper production. So the first step is to extract the ores, and then they would have these roasters roasting the ores to get like because what we have is like many sulfides, so they are kind of toxic. So they have to first roast them to get all the sulfides and all the oxides out of the ores, and then after that they would collect the remains, and then they have these specially built furnaces into the face of like the rocky mountains, and they would smelt them. That's where the slags come from. So when you smelt them, you would have the copper ore actually in the bottom. You would extract the copper ore, and you have to break down your furnace. So your furnace is like a one-time thing. You build the furnace, you use it, and you throw out all the garbage, including all the slag waste, and then you would just extract the ingot out of it. And then from the ingot, from the ingot to the tools, we don't have a special. We didn't discover any like molds to produce these tools. We have the tools. We didn't discover the molds yet. So we have the tools, and based on the seam lines on the tools, we can see that they use like a double-sided mold to produce them. So they put these molds together. They put the copper, and then that's how they produce. But we didn't discover the mold, so we are not completely sure like the exact process that they use.
It's fascinating that you can tell something about the process, the molds, from the final tool itself. That's very cool. Can you tell anything about the types of people who are engaged in metal processing from the leftover slag, from what you're looking at in your study?
The type of people, you mean like the kind of communities that they have?
Yeah, types of communities, socioeconomic status of the people, anything.
Yeah, actually, I'm really glad that you asked this question, because this is something that I'm really interested in. So definitely they are like agricultural and also semi-pastoralist. So they would have held camel, goats, because we discovered the remains as well. Camel, goats, and also they have like palm groves. They grow palms and everything. But what I want to talk about is the socioeconomic people who actually gather charcoal, because at least for the early Islamic era, we have a lot of texts talking about like what kind of people were engaged in this kind of industry, and mainly like the elderly and the disabled people were engaged in collecting the wood, because they couldn't go to the field, or they couldn't be used in the mines because they were not strong enough. So that's why they were sent out to collect wood. So it was one of the lowest jobs, or lowest, let's say, careers that you can have. It would usually like the people who could not do anything else that were used for this, and we know this from the texts from the early Islamic era.
Interesting. So you have texts that describe these processes then too?
So we have texts that describes the laws that were regulated the industry, because like you have to rent the mountain from the local ruler. You have to organize a lot of connections between people. So that's like these kind of legal texts that we have. And also we have a lot of folk tales, like a lot of stories that describe the collection of the wood, or like the characters who were mainly doing this hard work, because it was very hard. It was given an example of like hard work and labor. So whenever they wanted to describe something that is like unhumanly hard and like beyond the capability of anyone else, they would have described this kind of low rewarding labor.
That's fascinating. It feels like you've got such a wide array of evidence to take into account for this study.
Yeah, it's already too much.
A reminder to everyone watching in, feel free to type out any questions you have for Amir. I'm sure he'd be glad to answer them. In the meantime, while you're typing those out, I'll continue throwing questions at him. I'm curious if you find that there's a continuity in the types of these furnaces and the types of processes, or do you see individual distinctions in between or in various communities?
We see continuity like in terms of like a spatial continuity, but like for temporal continuity, as I said, because we have that periodicity issue, we can definitely distinguish, for example, between Iron Age slags and early Islamic slags. They're like totally separate things, the different processes. And interestingly, sometimes like in the later periods, they went down to those older slags and extracted some of those older slags because they already had like a little bit of copper left in them because the older process was not efficient enough. So they would have extracted. So you would see go to these like slags and you see like a big hole there because people went there, dig a lot of these slags, went them and reprocessed them and to extract coppers because probably some of the mines, they were already exhausted. So they didn't have like access to the original ores anymore. So whenever they wanted to produce something, they went to these slags, gathered a little bit of them and then reprocessed them for more copper.
That's interesting. So they just returned to the site of their previous work to do it better and more thorough now.
Yeah, site of their ancestors' work, yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Great. If you have any questions for anyone watching there, feel free to type them in. Amir, I'm going to keep asking you about this process then. Do you know, do processing of ores in the modern world still follow any of these same steps, or is it vastly different now than how it was?
Vastly different. It's all industrial now, so it's vastly different now. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to produce it. So we do some kind of like experimental archaeology. It takes you like, for this much copper, it takes you like a whole night. So obviously it's not efficient anymore. It's very labor intensive.
How much do you start with to get that amount of copper from it?
This much, you probably get this much copper, like a bag of this by this, and then you get this much copper out of it. It depends on the ore and everything. We get like very good ore, and this is how much you get. And it's very labor intensive, and you have to keep blowing the fire. You have to keep the fire going for the process to continue. And yeah, and we use leaf blowers, so that's actually make it easier. But if you want to use like other things, even your mouth or any other tools, it would be very difficult.
Yeah, much more labor intensive. So we do have a question from the chat now. Did any of the processes related to metal processing cause human health effects?
Yeah, definitely. So when we have these like copper, because when we have these copper slags or like slag heaps that are in the environment, they definitely, when we test the soil, it makes the soil toxic. And especially the groundwater is toxic for human use. So many of the farmers around the slag heaps know not to dig their wells around the slag heaps. And actually the farms around the slag heaps are the cheapest because they cannot dig holes around them. So as you see, like the farms are usually further away from these slags, and definitely they contaminate the soil, especially when they remain in the environment for a long time. They contaminate the soils and they contaminate the groundwater.
Wow, so that has a lasting impact on the communities then.
It does.
What is the relationship between these processing sites and the mines used to get the natural resources to process? Are they right near each other?
They are very near each other. Like for the early Iron Age, they are just like, so you have these mountains, and on the slopes of the mountains, you have these slag heaps coming down to the flat areas. So when, for example, you would just go up and you see like even the tracks that they used to go to different shaft mines that they had, and then they didn't carry it that far. They carried it a little bit downhill to the slopes, and then they started, because we have the slags there, we know that they started to do that. And for the early Islamic era, it's a little bit further away, but not that far, probably like 1 or 2, like even less than a kilometer.
Wow, that's very close.
It is.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, Amir. Your research sounds fascinating.
Thank you so much for the opportunity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for all of you for tuning in and for asking such interesting questions to our candidates. We'll be back again tomorrow with some more Assyriology candidates. So hopefully we'll see you back then with your questions ready to go. Thanks again, everyone.